The headstone gleamed wet under early morning mist, drops of condensed fog sliding down granite like tears the stone itself could not produce. Frank Murphy stood before it, 72 years compressed into a frame that had once carried muscle but now held mostly memory and resolve. His knees ached in the cold. His lungs burned with every breath. Stage 3 lung cancer, the oncologist had said 6 weeks ago. Maybe 8 months if he got aggressive with treatment, maybe 6 without. Frank had chosen 6. The inscription read simple and true. Sarah Murphy, 1951-2019, beloved wife. No flourishes. Sarah wouldn't have wanted them. She'd been a straight talker, a woman who believed in deeds over decoration, in showing love through action rather than words. Frank placed the bouquet of white roses, her favorite, though she'd never said so aloud, against the base and lowered himself to one knee with a grimace that traveled up his spine like lightning. His voice came out rough, abraded by decades of cigarettes and shouting orders over Harley engines, and the particular kind of screaming that only happens in nightmares born from war. I'm dying, love. The cemetery sprawled empty around him, rows of the dead stretching toward a tree line where early birds tested their morning songs. Lincoln Memorial Park held 15,000 souls, and Frank knew the location of exactly one. The rest were strangers whose stories he'd never know, whose mistakes and triumphs had been buried with them, whose legacies existed only in the fading memories of shrinking circles of mourners who themselves would soon need stones. Doc says 6 months, maybe less. The cancer's in my lungs, spreading to the lymph nodes. Vietnam finally got me. Just took 53 years to finish the job. A breeze disturbed the roses. Frank watched petals shiver. I need to tell you something. Need to confess. The memory rose unbidden, as it had every night for more than half a century. Vietnam, 1970, a village whose name he'd never learned because names didn't matter when you were 19 and terrified and following orders from a lieutenant who'd graduated from West Point but had never learned that not all victories were worth winning. The village burned. Frank could still smell it. Thatch and flesh, in the particular sweetness of napalm mixing with cooking fires that would never cook another meal. His squad had been told to secure the area, eliminate VC sympathizers, and leave no witnesses. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. She'd hidden in the rubble of what might have been a school or temple. Frank had never been sure which. When he found her, her eyes had gone wide with a terror so pure it had cracked something fundamental in his chest. She'd clung to his leg, small hands gripping fatigue pants with desperate strength, and in broken English. Someone had taught her, maybe missionaries, maybe refugees. She'd whispered the only words she knew that might save her. Please, GI. Please help. Frank had taught her his name in the 30 seconds they'd had before Lieutenant Morrison, no relation to Bear, though the coincidence still haunted Frank sometimes, had shouted for the squad to move out. The girl had repeated it, her pronunciation clumsy but earnest. Frank, Frank, please. He'd been forced to leave her. The lieutenant had made it clear. Orders were orders, and soldiers who didn't follow orders got court-martialed or worse. The village had been slated for destruction to deny the Viet Cong resources. No exceptions, no children extracted. Frank had pulled his leg free from her grip. He could still feel her fingernails dragging across fabric, and walked away while she screamed his name. The village burned completely. Frank never learned if she'd made it out. I hear her every night, he told Sarah Stone. Every single night for 53 years, I hear her screaming, Frank, help. And I wake up knowing I didn't. The cancer diagnosis had brought a strange clarity. Time, which had always seemed infinite in the abstract way that young men believe they're immortal, had suddenly acquired borders and boundaries. 6 months. Maybe 8 if he wanted to spend them vomiting from chemotherapy, losing weight, becoming a ghost of himself while doctors fought a battle he knew they'd lose. Frank had declined treatment. I need to do one thing right before I go, he told the headstone. One thing that balances the scales if there are scales to balance. I couldn't save that girl in Vietnam. But maybe if I can save one child before I die, it'll mean something. Maybe you'll be proud of me when I see you again. Maybe I'll be able to look that Vietnamese girl in the eye, wherever she is, and tell her I learned. I became better. He stood with difficulty, joints protesting. The sky had lightened from charcoal to slate, dawn approaching with the inevitability of all endings. I don't know who that child will be yet, don't know how or when, but I'm asking you, love, if there's any way you can guide me, any sign you can send, I'm watching for it. I'm ready. Frank turned from the grave and walked toward his motorcycle, a 1985 Harley-Davidson FXRT that he'd bought the year he'd founded the Iron Shields and maintained with a devotion that bordered on religious. The engine turned over on the first try, rumbling to life with the particular thunder that had always made his heart steady when nothing else could. The ride back to the clubhouse took 20 minutes through streets just beginning to wake. Chicago's Bridgeport neighborhood sprawled industrial and working class, the kind of area where people minded their business and asked few questions as long as you didn't bring trouble to their doorsteps. The Iron Shields had been part of the landscape for 38 years, long enough that most residents had forgotten the club was once considered dangerous. Long enough that the bar had become just another fixture like the corner bodega or the bus stop where shift workers waited in the cold. Frank pulled into the lot behind the building, parking in his usual spot near the kitchen entrance. The bar itself occupied the ground floor of a two-story brick structure that had once housed a meatpacking operation before regulations and economics had driven that business elsewhere. The upper floor held sleeping quarters for members who had nowhere else or needed distance from situations that required distance. Frank had lived upstairs for 15 years after Sarah died, though lately he'd been considering whether dying in the same room where he'd spent 30 years of marriage might be preferable to dying in a clubhouse surrounded by brothers who try to convince him to fight longer. The interior smelled like stale beer and wood polish, and the ghost of 10,000 cigarettes smoked before the city banned indoor smoking. Frank moved through the main room, tables scattered haphazard, a bar running the length of the west wall, patches and photographs covering every vertical surface in a collage of brotherhood and history, and climbed stairs that protested under his weight. His room waited exactly as he'd left it, bed made with military precision, a habit 53 years couldn't break. Desk holding a laptop he barely knew how to operate and preferred not to. Photographs in frames, Sarah on their wedding day, 1975, both of them young and convinced love could heal anything. The Iron Shield's founding members, 1980, 12 men who'd found each other in the wreckage of wars both foreign and domestic. Bear Morrison at 18, fresh out of the Marines with eyes that had already seen too much. Frank lowered himself into the desk chair and opened the laptop. The screen glowed to life, desktop background showing Sarah's face from a trip they'd taken to Door County 2 years before the cancer took her. He clicked through to email, found the message he'd been avoiding for 3 days, and finally opened it. The oncologist had sent results from the latest scan. Frank scrolled through medical terminology that meant nothing until he reached the conclusion. Cancer had metastasized to lymph nodes and liver. Treatment options remained available, but prognosis had worsened. Estimated time without intervention, 4 to 6 months. With aggressive chemotherapy, possibly 12 to 14, though quality of life would be significantly impacted. 4 to 6 months. Frank closed the laptop and turned to face the window. Dawn had arrived fully now, pale light washing across buildings and empty streets in a city that would continue long after he'd stopped being part of it. Somewhere in that city, a child was suffering. Statistically, hundreds of children were suffering in ways that would break hearts if those hearts were paying attention. Frank couldn't save them all. He knew that. But one child saved might be enough to balance one child left behind in Vietnam. Footsteps sounded on the stairs, heavy boots taking steps 2 at a time with the energy Frank remembered having decades ago. The door opened without knocking because members didn't knock on Frank's door, not after 38 years of brotherhood. Bear Morrison filled the doorway, 6'5" and 300 pounds of muscle gone slightly soft around the middle, but still capable of inspiring respect through presence alone. 52 years old, gray threading through his beard, scars on his knuckles from fights both necessary and foolish. President of the Iron Shields for the past decade, though Frank still held the unspoken position of founder and final word when final words were needed. Bear's eyes found Frank's with the directness that had always defined him. "You went to the cemetery again." Frank didn't ask how Bear knew. Habits became predictable after enough years. "Needed to talk to Sarah." Bear crossed to the small refrigerator. Frank kept stock with water and cheap beer, extracted 2 bottles, twisted the caps off both, and handed one to Frank before settling onto the bed with a creak of springs. Doc's been asking about you, says you missed your last appointment. Didn't miss it, chose not to go. There's a difference? In my mind there is. Bear drank, throat working. When he lowered the bottle, his expression had shifted from casual concern to something harder to read. You're going to tell me what the scan said eventually, or do I need to call the doctor myself? Frank considered lying, discarded the notion immediately. Bear had known him too long for lies to hold. 4 to 6 months without treatment. Maybe a year with chemo that'll make me wish I was already dead. The words landed between them with the weight of artillery. Bear's jaw tightened, the only visible reaction before he forced his features back to neutral. You're not going to fight it. I'm 72, James. I'm tired. I've been tired since 1970. I think I've earned the right to choose when and how I go. What would Sarah say? Sarah would tell me to stop being stubborn and get treatment. Then she'd hold my hand through every session and pretend it wasn't killing her to watch me suffer. I'm not putting anyone through that, and she's not here to argue. Bear set his beer down carefully, movements controlled in the way that suggested he was managing larger emotions through smaller actions. So what's the plan? Sit here and wait to die? No, Frank met his eyes. I'm going to do one thing right before I go. One mission. One child saved. Then I'll be ready. You don't know there's a child who needs saving. There's always a child who needs saving. I'm just waiting to find out which one is mine. Bear studied him for a long moment, weighing whatever calculations presidents of motorcycle clubs learn to make when navigating the space between loyalty and wisdom. You'll tell me when you find them. I'll tell you when I find them, Frank confirmed. Bear stood, retrieved his beer, and moved toward the door. He paused at the threshold, hand on the frame, looking back. For what it's worth, old man, you've already done plenty right. The club, the brothers you've saved, the community work. Your scales balanced a long time ago. Frank shook his head. Not to me, they haven't. After Bear left, Frank remained at the window watching Saturday morning traffic begin its slow accumulation. The thought occurred to him that he'd spent most of his life watching for threats, watching for opportunities, watching for signs that might indicate which direction to move next. He'd watched Sarah die slowly over 18 months, cancer eating her from the inside while he held her hand and pretended he couldn't see death approaching. He'd watched Bear transform from an angry 18-year-old with PTSD and rage issues into a leader capable of commanding 71 men's respect. He'd watched the club grow from 12 desperate veterans into something that resembled family. Now he was watching for a child he didn't know, waiting for circumstances he couldn't predict, running out a clock that ticked down toward silence. The wait lasted 4 days. James Morrison, known to everyone who mattered as Bear, woke at 6 a.m. Saturday morning in the small apartment above the Iron Shields clubhouse with his ex-wife's number glowing on his phone screen. The preview of her text read, "James, Jake is in trouble. Please call." Bear's chest constricted. His son. Jake was 28, a public defender in Cook County, brilliant and idealistic in everything Bear had failed to be at that age. They hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since Jake's wedding when Bear had shown up drunk and picked a fight with the best man over some slight that Bear couldn't even remember now. Jake had told him to leave, told him he was tired of excuses and second chances, told him that sobriety didn't erase the childhood Bear had stolen through absence and addiction. Bear had left. He stared at the text, thumb hovering over the call button, anxiety and shame mixing in his gut the way they always did when Jake's existence forced itself into his awareness. The phone had been in his hand for 3 minutes when he finally set it down without responding. The apartment was sparse: bed, dresser, small kitchen that rarely saw use, bathroom with a shower that had never worked quite right. Bear owned a few possessions because possessions required maintaining, and maintenance required stability, and stability had always been more theoretical than practical in his life. A photograph sat on the dresser. Bear at 4 years old being held by his mother in front of their old apartment building. She'd been drunk when the photo was taken, though you couldn't tell from the image. Bear remembered the day because she dropped him immediately after the shutter clicked. A second photograph showed his daughter Mia, 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning in her kindergarten picture. Mia lived with her mother, Bear's second ex-wife Lisa, in a house in Oak Park with a yard and good schools and stability. Bear had joint custody, saw Mia every other weekend and Wednesday evenings. Those visits represented the only times he consistently felt like he was doing something right. He dressed in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, the daily uniform of men who'd stopped caring about fashion sometime around their second deployment. The mirror showed a face that had aged harder than 52 years should produce, lines carved deep around eyes, gray dominating what had once been dark brown in his beard. Scars on his cheek from a motorcycle accident when he was 23 that had nearly killed him and probably should have. The Iron Shield's cut hung on a hook by the door, black leather vest with the club's burnt orange shield emblem on the back, various patches indicating rank and history and affiliations. Bear pulled it on, feeling the familiar weight settle across his shoulders, like armor or burden, depending on the day. Downstairs, the clubhouse already held early risers. Doc Chen stood behind the bar, measuring coffee grounds with the precision of someone who'd once measured medication dosages in combat hospitals. Daniel had been a medic in Vietnam, drafted in 1970 at 22, served 2 years watching young men die from wounds that stateside hospitals could have treated easily. He'd come home with nightmares and a morphine habit that had taken 15 years to break. Now 65, white threading through black hair he kept cut military short, he served as the club's de facto medical officer and vice president. Doc looked up when Bear entered, eyes finding his with the directness of men who'd known each other long enough to skip pleasantries. "You look like shit." "Good morning to you too." "Coffee?" "Please." Doc poured black coffee into a chipped mug, slid it across the bar. Bear caught it and drank, grateful for heat and caffeine and the small ritual of morning that didn't require thinking. "Jennifer texted," Bear said after the second sip. "Says Jake's in trouble." "You call her back?" "No." "Why not?" "Because Jake doesn't want my help. Made that clear 3 years ago." Doc wiped down the bar with slow, methodical movements that suggested he was thinking through his response rather than reacting immediately. "Kid's 28. People change. Situations change. Maybe trouble's big enough he's willing to put pride aside. Or maybe Jennifer's interfering and Jake doesn't even know she reached out. Only one way to find out." Bear drank more coffee, using the act to delay decision-making. The truth was he desperately wanted to call, wanted any excuse to hear his son's voice, wanted the opportunity to prove he'd become someone worth knowing. But wanting didn't override the fear that Jake would reject him again, that whatever trouble existed would be blamed on Bear's failures as a father, that trying to help would only make things worse. The front door opened, admitting morning light and Gabriel Pierce. Ghost, 61, lean and weather-worn, eyes that still held the wariness of someone who'd spent decades in the CIA's darker corners, carried a newspaper under one arm, and moved with the careful economy of motion that suggested he was always conserving energy for when situations required sudden action. He nodded to Bear and Doc, claimed a stool at the bar, and spread the Chicago Tribune across the surface. His finger traced headlines before stopping on a story below the fold. Sterling Academy for the Deaf announced major expansion yesterday. Richard Sterling, headmaster, says they're adding capacity for 50 more students starting next fall. Doc glanced at the story without much interest. "That's the expensive one up in Lincoln Park, right?" $4,000 a month, Ghost confirmed. "Caters to wealthy families with deaf kids who want the best ASL education money can buy." Bear had no particular feelings about deaf education or expensive schools, but something in Ghost's tone suggested there was more to the observation than casual interest. "Why do I think you're about to tell me something I don't want to know?" Ghost looked up from the paper, face carefully neutral in the way that meant he'd found something worth investigating. "Richard Sterling, 61, family money going back to the Gilded Age. 3 divorces, each wife signed NDAs and took substantial settlements. No criminal record, but I ran his name through some databases I still have access to. And man spent time in Vietnam in 1973 doing charity work with orphanages." State Department opened an investigation in 1974 regarding inappropriate conduct with children, then closed it 6 months later with no charges filed. Records were sealed. The air in the room shifted. Bear set his coffee down carefully, attention now fully focused on Ghost. Define inappropriate conduct. File doesn't specify, just notes that multiple Vietnamese staff members reported concerns, American embassy got involved, then everything went quiet. Sterling returned to the States shortly after. Doc had stopped wiping the bar, his own expression hardening into something that looked like recognition mixed with old pain. How'd a rich Boston boy avoid the draft? Family connections, Ghost said. Father donated heavily to the right political campaigns. Richard got a medical deferment for asthma that conveniently disappeared after 1975. Bear felt something cold settle in his stomach. Draft dodgers who used wealth and privilege to avoid service, while working-class kids died in rice paddies, represented a particular kind of injustice that still burned hot even 5 decades later. But draft dodging combined with investigations into inappropriate conduct with children, that combination suggested something on darker. Why are you looking into him? Ghost folded the newspaper precisely, movements deliberate. Because yesterday I saw him at a coffee shop in Bridgeport, 2 blocks from here. He was talking to a woman, looked upset, and when she left, he stayed watching a deaf girl who was signing with her mother across the room. Watched her for 10 minutes with an expression that made my instincts light up. Instincts from CIA work? Instincts from being human and recognizing when someone's looking at a child the wrong way. Doc's hands had gone still. When he spoke, his voice carried an edge Bear had rarely heard. You think he's a predator. I think he's someone worth watching. And I think if a man with his history and his access to vulnerable children is operating 2 blocks from our clubhouse, we have a responsibility to pay attention. Bear wanted to dismiss it as ghost paranoia, the occupational hazard of men who had spent careers looking for threats in shadows. But Ghost's instincts had kept him alive through 30 years of espionage, and those instincts rarely triggered without cause. What do you want to do? Keep eyes on him, casual surveillance. See if patterns emerge. And if they do? Ghost's expression hardened into something that belonged more to the man he'd been during Cold War operations than the semi-retired veteran he pretended to be now. Then we decide what justice looks like when the system failed the first time. Elena Martinez turned 9 years old on a Tuesday in March, though the celebration consisted only of her mother managing to bake a small cake between double shifts at the physical therapy clinic. Kat Martinez, 34, exhausted, running on determination and caffeine, had smiled and sung happy birthday in halting ASL, while Ellie blew out candles and made a wish she didn't believe would come true. The wish was simple: make it stop. Nobody knew it needed to stop. That was part of how he'd designed it. Richard Sterling had spent 50 years perfecting the art of finding children whose disabilities made them simultaneously vulnerable and difficult to believe. Deaf children couldn't articulate trauma the way hearing children could, especially when trauma involved concepts for which ASL had vocabulary, but the children using it lacked context. How did a 9-year-old explain that the touching felt wrong when they'd been taught their entire lives that physical contact was a normal part of communication in deaf culture? Ellie sat in the supply closet on Friday afternoon, having been lured there under the pretense of helping Sterling find old hearing aid batteries he claimed were stored on the top shelf. Her hands shook as she signed desperately into darknesses that no one could see. Help, please. Someone help. Her voice, hoarse and unpracticed from limited use, produced sounds she couldn't hear but could feel vibrating in her throat. Help me. The closet door opened. Sterling stood backlit by hallway fluorescence, his expression shifting from the gentleness he showed publicly to something colder and more calculating. He signed with practiced fluency. Remember what we discussed, Elena? This is our secret. If you tell anyone your mother loses her scholarship arrangement, you'll have to leave Sterling Academy. You'll go to a public school where no one knows ASL. You'll be completely alone. Ellie's chest constricted. Public school represented her greatest fear, being the only deaf student in a sea of hearing kids who wouldn't be able to communicate with her, teachers who'd treat her like she was intellectually disabled rather than just deaf. Isolation so complete she might as well not exist. Sterling's hands continued moving. I'm the only one who truly understands you, the only one who appreciates how special you are. Don't ruin that. He reached toward her. Ellie closed her eyes. 30 minutes later, she ran from the building, shoes pounding concrete she couldn't hear, but could feel jarring up through her legs. Panic drove her movements. Not home, because going home meant explaining, and explaining meant her mother's devastated face and possibly losing the school that was her entire social world. Not to friends, because what 9-year-old wanted to admit what had happened to someone who might not believe them, or worse, might believe them and be powerless to help. Ellie ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out, until she found herself in an industrial neighborhood she'd visited once before for reasons she barely understood. 2 weeks earlier, she'd witnessed something that had lodged in her memory with unusual clarity. She'd been walking home from therapy. A physical therapist Kat knew had agreed to see Ellie pro bono for some minor coordination issues related to her inner ear when she'd passed a corner market. Outside, a man had been hitting a boy around 12 years old, fist connecting with the kid's shoulder hard enough to send him stumbling. A large man on a motorcycle had stopped. 6'5", heavily muscled, gray beard, wearing a leather vest that marked him as part of some group Ellie didn't recognize. The man had gotten off his bike, walked over, and grabbed the abuser's wrist mid-swing. What happened next had unfolded in a way that made Ellie understand power dynamics she'd previously only theorized about. The biker hadn't yelled or threatened. He'd simply signed to the boy. "Are you okay?" The boy, also deaf, Ellie had realized, had shaken his head, tears streaming. The biker had turned to the abuser. "That's your son? None of your business. It is now. You have two choices. Walk away and don't come back, or I call the police and explain what I saw. Your choice." The man had left. The biker had knelt next to the boy and signed with careful precision. "You're safe now. What's your name?" Ellie had watched from across the street as the biker called someone, a social worker maybe, or police, and stayed with the boy until help arrived. The memory had impressed itself on her consciousness. Here was someone who protected children. Here was someone who knew ASL. Here was someone who intervened when others walked past. She'd followed the biker at a distance when he'd eventually returned to his motorcycle, tracked him 2 blocks to a building with motorcycles parked outside and a faded sign reading, "Iron Shields MC." Now, running from Sterling Academy with nowhere else to go and no one else to trust, Ellie's feet carried her toward that building with the desperate logic of a drowning person reaching for any floating object. The bar's exterior looked dangerous in ways Ellie had been taught her entire life to avoid. Rough brick, barred windows, the kind of place her mother would cross the street to avoid passing. But danger, Ellie had learned, wasn't always where adults said it would be. The headmaster of her expensive school with his gentle smile and ASL fluency had heard her 17 times over 6 months. Maybe the scary-looking men in the scary-looking building would be different. She slipped through a side gate, crossed a parking lot where 23 motorcycles sat in careful rows, and found a kitchen door propped open with a cinder block. Music thumped from inside. She couldn't hear it, but felt vibrations through her shoes. Cooking smells drifted out. Burgers, fried food, beer. Ellie stepped inside. The kitchen was empty, though evidence of active cooking covered every surface. Through a doorway, she could see the main bar area. Men everywhere, leather vests with matching patches, tattoos covering visible skin. The kind of scene that would have sent her mother into protective overdrive. But Ellie had learned to read faces and body language in ways hearing children never needed to develop. These men were laughing, relaxed. One was showing photos to another, grandchildren, maybe. A third was arm wrestling while others cheered. The scene radiated celebration rather than threat. Her eyes found the man from 2 weeks ago. He sat at a table with an older man, both of them talking in what looked like serious discussion. The older man had white hair and a face carved by time and hardship into something that suggested wisdom alongside weariness. The older man saw her first. His eyes widened. Then his expression shifted through surprise into something that looked almost like recognition, even though they'd never met. He stood slowly, movements careful, and walked toward her while the rest of the bar gradually registered her presence and conversation died. Ellie's heart hammered. This was crazy. This was dangerous. This was... The old man knelt in front of her, wincing slightly as his knees took his weight. His hands rose and began forming signs in careful, formal SL. Are you safe, child? The question broke something in Ellie's chest. Safe. When was the last time she'd felt safe? When had safety stopped being her default state and become something she desperately sought? Her hands moved before she could stop them. Old man, you feed the dogs, I bore you. You're kind. Can you help me? The old man's face transformed, eyes filling with moisture that looked like it came from somewhere deeper than this moment. His hand signed again. What's your name? Elena. Ellie. I'm Frank. What do you need, Ellie? Her hands trembled as she formed the signs. The words felt impossible, but they came anyway. He touched me in the dark. Silence spread like a shockwave. Every man in the bar turned toward her. The large biker from 2 weeks ago stood, his face shifting from pleasant conversation to something harder and more focused. He crossed the room in 3 strides, knelt beside Frank, and his hands began signing. Who touched you? The headmaster. At my school, Richard Sterling. Frank's hands clenched into fists, then deliberately relaxed. His next signs came slower, controlled. How many times? Ellie counted on her fingers. 17 incidents over 6 months. Each one burned into memory with perfect clarity because trauma had a way of making moments permanent. 17. The large biker, Bear, someone had called him, turned to Frank. They exchanged a look that communicated volumes without needing words or signs. Frank nodded once, then turned back to Ellie. Elena, my name is Frank Murphy. This is Bear Morrison. You are safe now. Do you understand? No one will hurt you anymore. We promise. Ellie's knees buckled. Bear caught her before she fell, his large hands gentle despite their size. He lifted her easily and carried her to a chair, while Frank addressed the bar in a voice that carried command. Everyone listen. This child is under our protection. Her name is Elena. Someone hurt her, and we're going to make sure they answer for it. Doc, get over here. A man who looked Asian and professorial hurried over, knelt in front of Ellie. Elena, I'm Doc. I used to be a medic. Can I make sure you're not hurt? Just checking. Nothing invasive, okay? Ellie nodded. Doc's examination was quick and professional, checking for visible injuries, asking permission before touching, explaining what he was doing even though the explanations came through Bear's translation into ASL. No visible injuries, Doc reported quietly. But we need to get her to a hospital. Get a rape kit. No, Ellie's voice came out hoarse but firm. No hospitals. Please. Bear's hand signed. Why not? Because hospitals mean police, and police mean telling my mom, and telling my mom means she'll blame herself and maybe pull me from school and I'll lose everything. Bear looked at Frank. Frank looked at Doc. Some conversation happened between them in voices Ellie couldn't hear, though she could read the tension in their postures. Finally, Bear's hand signed again. Elena, we need to call your mother. She's probably worried sick. I'll tell her I'm at a friend's house. That's lying. I've been lying for 6 months. One more night won't matter. Frank's hand touched her shoulder gently. His signs came with the weight of someone making a promise they intended to keep. Child, I'm an old man. I'm dying. And before I go, I'm going to make sure you are protected. I swear on my wife's grave. I swear on every brother I lost in Vietnam. You will be safe. Do you believe me? Ellie looked into his eyes, roomy and tired but holding absolute conviction, and made a decision based on instinct and desperation. I believe you. The War Council convened in the upstairs conference room at 11 p.m. After Ellie had been settled in one of the sleeping quarters with a female bartender named Mercy standing guard, and Kat Martinez had been called with a story about Ellie staying overnight at a friend's house for a birthday party. 71 members of the Iron Shields had been summoned. Not all could attend on short notice, but 43 showed up within 2 hours, filling the conference room past capacity until men lined the walls and sat on floors and stood in the hallway straining to hear. Frank Murphy sat at the head of the table, Bear to his right, Doc to his left. Ghost, Razor, and Bull occupied the remaining seats. The core leadership, the men who'd been with the club longest and whose judgment Frank trusted most. Bear spoke first, his voice carrying the particular tone he used when issuing orders, rather than making suggestions. Everyone here knows why we've been called. A 9-year-old deaf girl came to us tonight seeking protection from a predator. That predator is Richard Sterling, headmaster of Sterling Academy for the Deaf. Before we discuss action, Frank has something to tell you. Frank stood slowly, hands gripping the table edge for support. The cancer had been eating him from the inside for months, and standing for extended periods required more effort than he liked admitting. His voice, when it came, carried the roughness of damaged lungs and the weight of impending mortality. Some of you know what I'm about to say, most don't. 3 months ago, I was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. It spread to my lymph nodes and liver. Without treatment, I have 4 to 6 months. With aggressive chemotherapy, maybe 12, but I'd spend most of that time too sick to function. Silence crashed over the room like a physical force. Men who'd known Frank for decades looked stricken. Newer members who'd heard stories about the founder now faced the reality that legends were mortal. I've chosen not to pursue treatment. I'm 72. I'm tired. I've been tired since Vietnam, and I think I've earned the right to choose my ending. Someone in the back, Frank thought it might be Gunnar Jackson, a 55-year-old Marine veteran who'd served in Desert Storm, cleared his throat loudly in the way men did when they were fighting emotion. Frank continued, "But before I go, I need to do one thing right. 53 years ago in Vietnam, I was ordered to abandon a village that was being destroyed. There was a little girl, maybe 7 years old. She begged me to save her. I couldn't. I was following orders. I left her there, and I've heard her screaming my name every night since." His hands shook. Bear half rose, ready to provide support, but Frank waved him back. Tonight, Elena walked into our bar seeking protection. She's 9 years old. She's deaf. She's terrified. And she trusted us when she had every reason not to. That child in Vietnam, whose name I never learned. I couldn't save her, but I can save this one. This is my last mission, brothers. This is what I'm doing with whatever time I have left. Frank's eyes swept the room, meeting each man's gaze with the intensity that had always defined his leadership. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand. This isn't just about Elena. This is about who we are. We're not a motorcycle club. We're not a gang. We're a brotherhood of broken men who found each other when the world had written us off. We're veterans and addicts and ex-cons and failures who decided that our mistakes didn't have to define our endings. His voice strengthened, conviction overriding physical weakness. Elena needs protection, and we're going to provide it. Richard Sterling has been hurting children for 50 years. Ghost found evidence going back to Vietnam in 1973. He's used wealth and privilege to avoid consequences. He's weaponized children's disabilities to ensure they couldn't report clearly. He represents everything we fought against in wars and everything we've rebuilt ourselves to oppose in peace. Frank paused, letting the words settle. Now, I need a vote. This will cost us. Time, money, possibly legal trouble. I'm asking every man in this room, are you willing to fight for one 9-year-old girl who has no one else? Bear stood. I'm in. Doc rose next. For Elena and for every child we couldn't save. Ghost, Razor, Bull, Gunner, one by one the core members stood. Then the men lining the walls. Then everyone in the hallway. 43 men rose to their feet in silent commitment. Frank felt something break loose in his chest. Some knot of tension he'd carried since 1970 finally beginning to unravel. Gentlemen, we have work to do. Ghost opened his laptop, projecting documents onto the wall screen. Richard Sterling, born 1963 in Boston to the Ashworth Sterling family, old money with connections to steel manufacturing and banking. Dodged Vietnam draft through medical deferment despite no ongoing health issues. Attended Harvard. Graduated 1985 with degree in education and child psychology. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Married 3 times. First wife, Margaret, divorced 1998, received $800,000 in settlement and signed an NDA. Second wife, Patricia, divorced 2007, received $1.2 million and signed an NDA. Third wife, Nicole, divorced 2019, received $2.5 million and signed an NDA. Bull, the club's forensic accountant, whistled low. Man pays for silence. Gets worse, Ghost continued. I accessed sealed records through contacts I still have. In 2009, an 11-year-old deaf girl at Sterling Academy reported abuse. Parents filed complaint. Sterling's lawyers offered $150,000 settlement with NDA. Parents took it. Who was the girl? Bear asked. Jennifer Walsh, now 24, living in Milwaukee. I tracked her down this afternoon, haven't made contact yet. Doc leaned forward, elbows on table. So we have one confirmed victim willing to testify, Elena. One historic victim who might be bound by NDA, and 50 years of suspected abuse with no legal consequences. Correct, Ghost confirmed. Also found evidence of a State Department investigation in 1974 regarding inappropriate conduct at a Vietnamese orphanage. Investigation was closed without charges after Sterling family made substantial donations to certain political campaigns. Razor, the club's security expert and former Secret Service agent, stood and moved to the projection. I pulled surveillance footage from Sterling Academy using a parent request. One of the members has a deaf nephew there. Found pattern of Sterling entering private rooms with different girls over past 5 years. Girls always alone, always deaf, always look disturbed when they exit. He clicked through images. Sterling entering a room, timestamp showing 40 minutes, exiting with a young girl whose body language screamed distress. At least 7 different victims in the footage I reviewed, and that's just the past 5 years. Bear's hands clenched into fists. So we have evidence of systematic abuse spanning 50 years, multiple victims, a pattern of buying silence, and institutions that have failed repeatedly to protect children. Correct, Ghost said. And our play is what? Go to the police? The same system that's failed every previous victim? Frank spoke quietly. We build a case so comprehensive and so public that the system has no choice but to act. We document everything legally. We find every victim willing to testify. We compile evidence that would convict him 10 times over. Then we hand it to authorities in a package so complete that ignoring it would be career suicide. And if they still ignore it? Someone asked from the back. Frank's expression hardened into something that belonged more to the young soldier who'd walked through burning villages than the old man dying of cancer. Then I'm dying anyway, and an old man can do things a young man with a future can't. But we try the legal route first. We do this right. For Elena. For all of them. Bear stood again. I need volunteers for specific tasks. Ghost, you continue intelligence gathering. Find every victim, every settlement, every piece of evidence that exists. Razor, security footage analysis and pattern documentation. Bull, financial forensics. Track every dollar Sterling's spent on silence. Doc, you coordinate medical support and victim services. He paused, scanning faces. I'll handle law enforcement liaison. I know Commander Patricia Hayes in child crimes. She's tough, but fair. If we bring her something solid, she'll act. Frank raised a hand. One more thing. We do this completely above board. No vigilante justice, no intimidation, no illegal surveillance. Everything we do has to be clean enough to stand up in court, because that's the only way Elena and the others get real justice. He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many men as possible. I know some of you want to handle this the old way. I understand that impulse. But this isn't about revenge. It's about protection. It's about making sure Sterling never touches another child. And that means doing it right even when right is harder. Gunner spoke from the back. What if he runs, rich guy with resources, sees us investigating, decides to flee to some country without extradition? Then we make sure someone's watching him 24/7, Bear said. He doesn't leave the state without us knowing. Ghost nodded. I can arrange that. Do it, Bear confirmed. The meeting continued for another hour, assigning roles and establishing protocols. By 1 a.m., every man knew his task. By 2 a.m., the initial investigative plan had been laid out. By 3 a.m., Frank Murphy sat alone in the conference room, exhausted and in pain, but feeling something he hadn't felt in 53 years. Purpose. Elena slept in the room down the hall, protected by brothers who'd sworn to keep her safe. Richard Sterling sat in his mansion unaware that his decades of immunity were ending. And Frank Murphy, dying but not yet dead, finally had his mission. The child he couldn't save in Vietnam had a name now, a face, a voice. Her name was Elena Martinez. She was 9 years old, and this time Frank would not fail. The Cook County Jail holding cell smelled like industrial cleaner, fighting a losing battle against decades of human despair. Frank Murphy sat on a metal bench, bolted to concrete, hands resting on knees that protested every small movement. 72 hours had passed since he'd pressed a loaded .45 against Richard Sterling's forehead, since Bear had talked him down from crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Since police had arrived to find an old man weeping in a mansion foyer, while a millionaire headmaster called lawyers instead of thanking God he was still breathing. Breaking and entering, aggravated assault, unlawful possession of a firearm in commission of a felony. The charges stacked up like cordwood, each one carrying sentences that would extend well past Frank's cancer timeline. The irony wasn't lost on him. Dying in prison versus dying in hospice represented a distinction without much practical difference when you measured remaining time in weeks rather than years. Bear had tried to post bail. Frank had refused. The decision made sense in ways he struggled to articulate even to himself. He'd committed crimes, real ones, not the kind that could be explained away or justified through righteous anger. He'd entered another man's home with violent intent, and that Sterling deserved worse than a gun to the head didn't make the action legal. Some part of Frank needed to sit with the consequence, needed to understand that choosing right didn't always mean avoiding wrong. He'd spent 53 years carrying guilt about abandoning a Vietnamese girl to orders he'd followed. Now he carried different guilt about nearly murdering a man whose death would have solved nothing and destroyed everything Elena needed. The cell door buzzed and swung open. A guard stepped aside, admitting a young man in a suit that had seen better days but still carried itself with the dignity of someone who believed in systems even when systems failed. Jake Morrison looked exactly like Bear had at 28. Same height, same build, same eyes that seemed older than the face containing them. But where Bear had been angry and volatile, Jake radiated controlled intensity, the kind that came from channeling rage into purpose rather than letting it consume everything in its path. He carried a leather briefcase worn at the corners, set it on the small table, and settled into the chair across from Frank with movements that suggested he'd done this 1,000 times before. "Mr. Murphy, I'm Jake Morrison, public defender assigned to your case." Frank studied him, seeing Bear in the jawline and the way he held himself too straight, like posture could substitute for certainty. "You're James's son." Not a question. Jake's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise or resignation. "I am." "That's not relevant to your case." "Everything's relevant when you're dying." Jake opened the briefcase, extracted a legal pad and pen, arranged them with unnecessary precision. Buying time, Frank recognized, the way people did when they needed a moment to decide how much truth to offer. "My father talks about you." "Does he?" "Every time I see him, which isn't often. Says you saved his life when he came back from Desert Storm. Says you gave him purpose when he had none." Frank leaned back against concrete, feeling cold seep through his shirt. "Your father saved his own life. I just pointed him in a direction that wasn't self-destruction." "That's more than most people get." Silence stretched between them, loaded with things neither man had vocabulary to address directly. Finally, Jake clicked his pen and shifted into professional mode. "The charges against you are serious. B&E, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful possession during commission of a felony. You're looking at 10 to 15 years if convicted on all counts. I'll be dead in 6 months. Cancer? Stage 3 lung, spread to lymph nodes and liver. I've declined treatment." Jake wrote something on the legal pad, though Frank suspected it had less to do with case notes and more to do with giving himself something to focus on besides the information he'd just received. "Mr. Sterling is pressing charges. His attorney is Robert Whitmore, one of the most expensive defense lawyers in Chicago. They're painting you as a dangerous criminal targeting a respected educator. I broke into his home and put a gun to his head. Not much painting needed." "Wait, the question hung simple and direct. Frank could have deflected, could have cited attorney-client privilege, or invoked his right to remain silent. Instead he told the truth. Because he's been raping deaf children for 50 years, and systems that should have stopped him took his money instead. Because a 9-year-old girl came to my bar seeking protection, and I wanted to make absolutely certain he could never hurt her again. Because I'm dying, and I've spent 5 decades hearing a Vietnamese child scream my name every night, and I thought killing one predator might balance abandoning one victim. Jake's pen had stopped moving. His expression shifted through several configurations before settling on something that looked like recognition. The girl, Elena Martinez? You know her? I know about her, but your club's investigation into Sterling has been making waves in certain legal circles. Some of my colleagues in the public defender's office have been discussing whether there's enough evidence to prosecute. And? Jake set the pen down carefully. Off the record, there's enough evidence to convict him 20 times over. But Sterling has connections. His family's donated millions to politicians and police charities. His lawyers are the kind who make cases disappear before they reach trial. The system you're trying to use against him is the same system he's used to protect himself for half a century. Frank felt something cold settle deeper in his chest, colder even than the cancer eating him from inside. So he wins. Not necessarily. Public pressure can force prosecution when legal pressure fails. If the story goes public, if victims come forward, if the evidence becomes too overwhelming to ignore, the system sometimes has no choice but to act. You sound like you've thought about this. I've spent 5 years as a public defender watching wealthy predators walk while poor kids go to prison for stealing food. You develop opinions. Frank studied him, seeing past the professional facade to the anger underneath. Your father and I, we're not trying to circumvent the law. We're trying to build a case so comprehensive that ignoring it becomes impossible. I know, I've seen some of the evidence Ghost compiled. It's thorough, maybe too thorough. Meaning? Jake's expression shifted into something more guarded. Meaning some of it was obtained through methods that might not survive legal scrutiny. Hacked emails, surveillance footage acquired without proper authorization, financial records accessed through channels that weren't exactly official. Frank nodded slowly. Ghost is CIO's old habits. Old habits that could get evidence thrown out and your entire case dismissed. The cell suddenly felt smaller. Frank had assumed that building evidence meant ensuring justice. The possibility that they'd been building a case that would collapse under legal examination hadn't occurred to him, though in retrospect it should have. What do you recommend? Jake leaned forward, elbows on knees, and for a moment Frank saw exactly what Bear must have looked like at this age. Idealistic and determined, and convinced that intelligence could overcome systems designed to resist change. Let me help. I have access to sealed records through public defender channels. I can request files legally that Ghost would need to hack. I can interview victims under attorney-client privilege. I can build a case that will stand up in court. Why would you do that? Because a 9-year-old girl trusted criminals to protect her when respected institutions failed. Because my father, who I've spent 10 years hating, is trying to do something genuinely good for the first time I can remember. Because I became a lawyer to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. And Elena Martinez represents everything I went to law school for. Frank felt his throat tighten in ways that had nothing to do with cancer. Your father loves you, talks about you every chance he gets, calls you the best thing he ever made and the biggest mistake he ever ruined. Jake's composure cracked slightly. He ruined a lot of things. Vietnam ruined him. PTSD ruined him. The VA failing veterans ruined him. He made choices, yes, but those choices came from a broken place. Doesn't excuse what he did to you and your mother, but maybe explains it. I didn't come here for family therapy. No, you came here because part of you wants to understand why your father would risk everything for a child he doesn't know. And I'm telling you, it's because he couldn't save you from his own demons. Can't go back and fix that. But he can save Elena from hers. Jake gathered his papers with movements that had become mechanical, shoved them into the briefcase with less care than he'd shown removing them. I'll start pulling Sterling's background through official channels, Vietnam files, State Department investigations, anything that's been sealed. Give me a week. I have 6 months. Take however long you need to do it right. Jake stood, briefcase in hand, and paused at the cell door. When he turned back, his expression had shifted into something more vulnerable. Mr. Murphy, Frank, when you almost killed Sterling, when my father stopped you, did you want to die? Is that what the cancer made you want? Frank considered the question, gave it the honesty it deserved. No, I wanted to live long enough to see Elena safe. Still do. Your father reminded me that revenge isn't the same as protection, that dying for nothing accomplishes less than living for something, even if that living is only measured in weeks. Jake nodded once, sharp and final, then left the cell with the guard locking steel behind him. Frank sat in renewed silence, feeling the weight of bars and concrete and time running out, but also feeling something else, hope maybe, or purpose, or the simple recognition that his last mission had just gained an unexpected ally. Somewhere in Chicago, Bear Morrison's estranged son was building a legal case against a predator, and maybe in doing so, building a bridge back to the father he'd lost. Daniel Chen stood behind the Iron Shields bar at 3 a.m., measuring bourbon into a glass with hands that had once measured morphine doses in Vietnamese field hospitals, but now shook from something that had nothing to do with age. 65 years old, sober for 12 years before 3 weeks ago. Now on his fourth drink of the night and considering a fifth while the bar sat empty except for ghosts and regrets. The envelope rested on the counter where he'd placed it 2 hours earlier after finally working up the courage to retrieve it from storage. Brown paper gone brittle with age, his own handwriting across the front. Lily's things do not open. He'd written that 8 years ago after the funeral, after watching his 8-year-old daughter lowered into ground that had no business receiving someone so young. Inside the envelope, drawings Lily had made in her final weeks, a school photograph from September 2016 where her smile looked forced, and a letter written in the careful block capitals of a child who'd learned writing but hadn't yet mastered it. Doc had never read the letter. Couldn't. The first line had been enough to send him into a spiral of grief and alcohol that had consumed 6 years. Even getting sober hadn't given him strength to read further. The letter had gone into the envelope into storage, and Doc had built a wall between himself and the truth his daughter had tried to tell him. Elena Martinez had demolished that wall. The moment Ellie had signed Sterling's name, Doc had felt something crack in his chest, recognition, horror, the sudden terrible understanding that his daughter's death might not have been the random tragedy he'd convinced himself it was. He'd gone to storage that night, found the box marked Lily, 2008-2016, and sat on the concrete floor reading by flashlight what his daughter had written 8 years ago. The letter was 3 paragraphs. Doc had it memorized now after reading it 47 times over the past 3 weeks. Dear Daddy, I'm sorry. I tried to be good, but I couldn't be good enough. The headmaster at school hurt me in bad ways I don't have words for. He said I should be grateful he paid attention to me because most people think Down syndrome girls are ugly. He said if I told anyone, he would make sure I got sent to a bad school where people would be mean. I was too scared to tell you good. I love you, Daddy. Tell Mommy I'm sorry. The headmaster's name is Mr. Sterling. Love, Lily. 3 paragraphs, 78 words, 8 years too late. Doc poured the 5th bourbon, watched amber liquid catch fluorescent light, and remembered the last time he'd seen Lily alive. She'd been sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, tongue caught between teeth in concentration, struggling with basic arithmetic that her disability made challenging. He'd kissed the top of her head, told her he loved her, and left for a night shift at the hospital where he still worked then, before grief had made him too unreliable for patient care. She'd taken the pills from his medicine cabinet sometime after midnight. Her mother, Doc's ex-wife, they'd divorced 2 years earlier over his PTSD and her inability to handle his nightmares, had found Lily in the morning, too late for intervention, just in time for devastation. The funeral had been small, the grief had been infinite. Doc had started drinking that night and hadn't stopped for 6 years. When he'd finally gotten sober through the Iron Shield's intervention and Frank Murphy's particular brand of tough love wrapped in understanding, he'd sealed Lily's memory away in boxes he'd vowed never to open. Now the boxes were open and the truth was impossible to ignore. Richard Sterling had killed his daughter, not directly, not with his own hands, but as surely as if he'd given her the pills himself. Footsteps on the stairs pulled Doc from spiraling thoughts. Bear appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with practiced assessment. Bottles on the bar, Doc's hands wrapped around glass, the envelope visible even from across the room. Doc. Just the name. No judgment, no anger. Bear had been through his own battles with alcohol, had crawled out of that particular hole through effort and help and the kind of brutal honesty that only came from hitting bottom hard enough to crack. Don't. Don't what? Don't try to talk me down. Don't give me the speech about staying sober. Don't tell me one drink leads to relapse. Bear moved behind the bar anyway, picked up the bourbon bottle, and poured himself 2 fingers before settling onto a stool. Wasn't going to, just going to drink with you. Doc stared at him. You've been sober 14 years. 13, and I'll be sober again tomorrow. But right now you're in pain, and drinking alone makes it worse. So you're going to relapse because I am? I'm going to sit with my brother while he works through something that's eating him from the inside. If that means having a drink so you're not alone, then that's what it means. Bear raised his glass. Doc, after a moment, raised his own. They drank in silence that stretched and settled. Finally, Doc pushed the letter across the bar. Read it. Bear read slowly, his expression transforming from neutral to horrified to something that looked like murder barely contained by will. When he finished, he set the letter down with hands that trembled slightly. Jesus Christ, Doc. She told me, right there in her suicide note. She told me who hurt her, and I never read far enough to see it. You couldn't have known. I should have known. She started having nightmares in March 2016, started refusing to go to school, started washing her hands compulsively, washing herself until her skin was raw. All the signs were there, and I missed every single one because I was too busy working night shifts and avoiding my ex-wife and pretending that if I just kept moving, I wouldn't have to face how broken I was. Bear's hand found Doc's shoulder, grip firm. Sterling is an expert. 50 years of practice manipulating children and parents and institutions. He knew how to hide, knew how to make abuse look like care. This is not your fault. My daughter is dead because I didn't protect her. That's definition of fault. Your daughter is dead because a predator targeted her and systems failed to stop him. You're a victim here too, Daniel. Not the primary victim. Lily is. But you lost your child to a man who should have been in prison decades before he ever touched her. Doc drained his glass, poured another with hands steadier than they'd been an hour ago. I want to kill him. Every cell in my body is screaming to find Sterling and make him suffer the way Lily suffered. Make him understand what it feels like to be helpless and terrified and alone. I know. Frank almost did it. Almost pulled the trigger. Sometimes I wonder if he should have. Frank made the right choice, so will you. How do you know? Bear's expression hardened into something that carried absolute conviction. Because killing Sterling gives him an easy out. A bullet ends his suffering in seconds. But destroying his life, his reputation, his freedom, his legacy, that suffering lasts however long he lives, and watching him rot in prison knowing he'll never touch another child, that's justice Lily deserves. Doc looked at the letter again, his daughter's careful handwriting blurring through moisture. There's something else. In 2016, I reported concerns of Sterling Academy, told them Lily was having nightmares, showed them drawings she'd made of a gray-haired man. They promised to investigate. A week later, the headmaster, Sterling, called me personally. Said he'd looked into it, that Lily was confused, that Down syndrome children sometimes had difficulty distinguishing reality from imagination. Said she needed therapy, not investigation. And you believed him. He was so convincing, so sympathetic, offered to waive tuition for the rest of the year so we could afford better therapy for Lily. I thought he was being generous. Bear's expression shifted to something darker. He was buying your silence. Preemptive damage control. I thanked him. I thanked the man who was raping my daughter for his kindness in helping her get mental health treatment. The horror of it crashed over Doc Fresh. 8 years of protective dissociation crumbling under the weight of truth finally confronted. His shoulders shook. Bear moved around the bar and pulled him into an embrace that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with preventing complete collapse. You didn't know, Bear repeated, the words steady even if they couldn't erase guilt. You made decisions based on information you had. Sterling manipulated that information. This is on him. On him, Daniel, not you. Doc pulled back, swiped at his eyes with hands that had held dying soldiers and delivered babies and now shook with rage barely contained. I need to do something. Need to make this mean something. Then testify. Put Lily's letter into evidence. Tell the world what Sterling did and how institutions protected him. Make sure every parent knows his name and what it represents. What if the system fails again? What if he buys his way out like he has for 50 years? Bear's voice dropped to something harder. Then we have a dying old man who's made peace with consequences. But we try law first, for Lily, for Elena, for every child who deserves to see justice work the way it's supposed to. Doc nodded slowly, decision crystallizing through grief and rage into something more focused. I need to find the other fathers. Other parents whose children Sterling hurt. Build a coalition. Make enough noise that ignoring us becomes impossible. Do it. Ghost has been compiling lists. At least 20 families received settlements over the past 30 years. Some of those children are adults now. Their parents deserve to know they weren't alone. And the ones who signed NDAs? NDAs don't cover criminal activity. They can break them to testify. Sterling's lawyers will threaten lawsuits, but those threats are empty once criminal charges are filed. Doc picked up his glass, stared at bourbon that represented familiar escape, and poured it down the drain. Then the bottle. Then every other bottle within reach until the bar sink ran with wasted alcohol and wasted years. I'm done drinking, done hiding, done letting that bastard win. Bear watched the liquor drain away, then raised his own glass in salute before pouring it out as well. Then let's get to work. Richard Sterling's counterattack launched with the precision of someone who'd spent 50 years perfecting the art of deflection. His attorneys filed harassment charges against Frank Murphy, civil suits against the Iron Shields, claiming defamation and witness intimidation, and restraining orders barring club members from approaching within 500 yards of Sterling Academy or Sterling's residence. The media campaign followed immediately. Sterling appeared on local news stations, CNN, NPR, every platform that would give him airtime to present himself as the victim of a dangerous biker gang with a vendetta against a respected educator. I've dedicated my life to helping deaf children, he said during a Channel 7 interview, his expression carefully calibrated to convey wounded dignity. These men have manufactured accusations from a confused child and are using them to destroy my reputation. I believe in due process. I believe in letting the legal system determine truth. But I also believe the public deserves to know when criminals target innocent citizens. The interviewer, a young woman who clearly hadn't done her homework, nodded sympathetically. What do you think motivates these accusations? Sterling spread his hands in a gesture of bewildered innocence. I honestly don't know. Perhaps they want publicity. Perhaps they're trying to extract money through legal threats. What I do know is that Elena Martinez is a sweet, confused girl who's been manipulated by men with criminal records and violent histories. The interview clip went viral. Conservative media outlets picked it up, running with narratives about vigilante bikers and rushed to judgment. Liberal outlets hedged, calling for investigation while noting that accusations deserve to be taken seriously. The comment sections exploded with debate. People who believed Sterling was innocent versus those who suspected his wealth was buying protection. Public opinion split 50-50, which Sterling's attorneys understood was good enough. Cases didn't need majority support to create reasonable doubt. Bear watched the interview from the Iron Shields conference room, Ghost and Razor flanking him, all three men radiating controlled fury. He's good, Ghost said quietly. Decades of practice lying. We need to counter this, Razor added. Can't let him control the narrative. We already are. The voice came from the doorway. Sarah Cross, 36, investigative journalist with the Chicago Tribune and a Pulitzer nomination for her series on institutional corruption, entered carrying a laptop and an expression that suggested she'd found something explosive. Ghost had contacted her a week earlier, feeding her information anonymously, while Sarah conducted her own parallel investigation. Now she settled at the conference table, opened her laptop, and turned the screen toward the three men. I've spent 18 days verifying every piece of information you have given me, interviewed victims off the record, traced financial records, reviewed sealed documents through FOIA requests, and contacted sources in the State Department about the Vietnam incident. She pulled up a draft article, headline reading, "The Predator in Plain Sight, How Richard Sterling Abused Children for 50 Years While Institutions Looked Away." This publishes tomorrow morning, 15,000 words, documented evidence of abuse dating back to 1973, 4 victims willing to go on record, including Daniel Chen's daughter's suicide note, financial trails showing over $3 million in hush money, State Department to cover up. The whole ugly story. Bear scanned the article, stomach tightening with each paragraph. Sarah had done what journalists were supposed to do, followed evidence wherever it led and presented truth without editorializing. What about Sterling's lawyers? Already lawyered up myself. Tribune's legal team reviewed every word. We're prepared for defamation suits, but confident we'd win. Everything sourced, every claim backed by documentation. And the victims? They're okay being named? Jennifer Walsh agreed to be quoted. Lily Chen's story is told through Daniel's testimony. He signed a release. 2 other adult victims agreed to named interviews. 3 more provided affidavits under pseudonyms. Elena Martinez is referenced only as a 9-year-old current student with no identifying information. Razor leaned forward. This changes everything. Once it's public, police have to investigate. Media pressure forces action. That's the idea, Sarah confirmed. I'll also be releasing supporting documents online, scanned evidence, court records, settlement agreements, everything transparent and verifiable. Ghost's expression shifted to something approaching satisfaction. When does it publish? Tomorrow, 6 a.m. I wanted you to know first. Also wanted to make sure you're prepared for blowback. Sterling's team will go after you hard. Let them come, Bear said. We've got nothing to hide. Sarah closed her laptop, met each man's eyes in turn. I'm doing this because 15 years ago, a teacher at my school was accused of inappropriate conduct with the students. Nothing happened. No investigation, no consequences. He taught for another decade before retiring with full pension. I've always wondered how many kids he hurt because we stayed silent. She stood, gathered her materials. This story is for every child who tried to tell and wasn't believed, for every parent who suspected but couldn't prove, for every institution that chose protecting reputation over protecting children. After Sarah left, the 3 men sat in silence processing implications. Tomorrow would bring firestorm. Sterling's reputation would be destroyed regardless of legal outcomes. But destruction of reputation didn't guarantee legal accountability, and without criminal charges, Sterling might still walk free. Bear's phone buzzed. Text from Jake Morrison. Found Vietnam files. State Department investigation included testimony from 12 Vietnamese orphans. All girls ages 7 to 13, all describing same pattern of abuse. Investigation closed after Sterling family donated $500K to certain officials' campaigns, forwarding everything to FBI. A second text followed. Also, need to talk about custody. Bear's chest tightened. Custody meant Mia, his 7-year-old daughter. Meant his ex-wife Jennifer had made good on threats to file for sole custody based on his involvement with the Sterling investigation. Problem? Ghost asked, reading Bear's expression. Jennifer filed for emergency custody of Mia. Hearings in 3 days. On what grounds? Father involved in criminal investigation exposes child to dangerous elements. Razor's jaw tightened. That's bullshit. You're protecting children, not endangering them. Try explaining that to a family court judge who sees biker gang and makes assumptions. Bear stood, paced to the window overlooking the parking lot where 23 motorcycles sat in neat rows. Each bike represented a brother, a man who'd chosen this family when blood families had failed or been destroyed. Losing them would break him. Losing Mia would destroy him. What does Jake say? Wants to talk. Probably to tell me he can't represent me because of conflict of interest. Or, Ghost suggested quietly, to tell you he will represent you because sometimes doing right means facing conflicts head on. Bear wanted to believe that, wanted to believe his son might choose reconciliation over resentment. But 10 years of estrangement created patterns difficult to break, and hope felt dangerous when disappointment had proven more reliable. Guess I'll find out. His phone rang. Jake's number? Bear answered, stepped into the hallway for privacy. Dad? The word hit like physical impact. Jake hadn't called him Dad in over a decade. The shift from James to Dad represented territory Bear had assumed was permanently closed. Jake, I'm representing you at the custody hearing. Already filed notice with the court. You can't. You're a public defender. Conflict of interest with Sterling case. I took vacation time. Representing you pro bono as your son, not as public defender. No conflict. Bear's throat closed around words he couldn't find. Jake continued, voice steady but carrying undercurrents Bear couldn't quite parse. I've reviewed Mom's filing. It's weak, circumstantial, I can beat it. But I need you to be honest with me about everything you're doing with the Sterling investigation. Everything's legal. Ghost, Razor, Bull. They're all being careful to document properly. Obtain evidence through legitimate channels. Frank Murphy held a man at gunpoint. Frank's dying and made a choice I don't agree with but understand. Doesn't reflect on the rest of us. Mom's lawyer will use it to paint the entire club as violent criminals. Then you'll need to explain that we stopped Frank, that we chose law over vigilante justice specifically because we believe in doing this right. Silence stretched. Bear could hear typing on Jake's end, paper shuffling. I'm going to need you to testify. About your PTSD, about why you founded the club, about the kind of men you've become versus who you were when I was growing up. Bear's chest constricted. Jake, I don't know if I can sit in court and explain to a judge why I was a terrible father to you while arguing I'm a good father to Mia. That's exactly what you're going to do. Because the man you were when I was 4 isn't the man you are now. And Mia deserves the father you've become, not punishment for the father you used to be. The words carried weight Bear hadn't expected, generosity he hadn't earned. Why are you doing this? Because Frank Murphy told me something that made me think. He said you're trying to save Elena because you couldn't save me. That protecting her is how you atone for failing your own son. It's not that simple. Maybe it is. Maybe you were broken and you broke our family and now you're trying to fix what you can. I spent 10 years being angry about what you destroyed. Maybe it's time to see what you're building. Bear leaned against the hallway wall, forehead pressed to cool concrete. I'm sorry, Jake, for everything, for not being there, for choosing alcohol, for missing your childhood. I can't fix that. Can't give you those years back. No, you can't, but you can show me you learned. Show me the man you became is worth knowing. What if the judge doesn't see it that way? Then we appeal. But I think once the court hears the full story, Sterling's crimes, the club's investigation, the choice to pursue legal justice instead of violence, they'll understand you're not criminals. You're men who found purpose protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Bear's phone buzzed with incoming text. Ghost. Sarah's article just posted early, trending on Twitter. Sterling's done. Jake, I need to go but thank you for this, for giving me a chance I don't deserve. See you at the hearing, Dad. The line went dead. Bear stood in the empty hallway feeling the weight of forgiveness he hadn't asked for, an absolution he couldn't claim but desperately needed. Downstairs, the bar had filled with members checking phones and computers, all reading Sarah Cross's article as it exploded across social media. The piece was devastating, methodical documentation of 50 years of abuse, victim testimony that painted Sterling as a calculated predator, financial evidence showing systematic cover-ups. Within an hour, Twitter had #JusticeForLily trending nationally. Within 2 hours, parents were organizing protests outside Sterling Academy. Within 3, the school's board of directors called an emergency meeting. Sterling's carefully constructed narrative collapsed under the weight of truth finally told. Bear's phone rang again. Commander Patricia Hayes. Morrison, I'm reading the Tribune article. Need you to come in. Now, bring every piece of evidence you have. You're finally investigating? FBI's taking lead. This is federal now. Trafficking across state lines. RACO implications. Possible government corruption charges. They want everything your people compiled. When? 2 hours. Federal building. Ask for Agent David Park. Bear disconnected. Address the room full of brothers. FBI wants evidence. We're about to find out if the system works. Frank Murphy's voice carried from the back, rough and tired, but holding conviction. Then let's show them why we believe in doing this right. The federal courtroom in the Dirksen building smelled like old wood and newer anxiety, afternoon light streaming through tall windows to illuminate dust motes drifting like snow that never landed. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park stood before 12 jurors, 8 veterans spanning Vietnam through Afghanistan, 4 civilians chosen for their lack of connection to either Sterling's wealth or the Iron Shield's reputation, and delivered an opening statement that felt less like legal argument than war declaration. Richard Ashworth Sterling spent 50 years perfecting predation. He didn't stumble into abuse. He engineered it, studied child psychology to understand vulnerability, learned ASL to access deaf children others couldn't communicate with, built an institution that gave him unlimited access to victims whose disabilities made reporting nearly impossible. Park clicked a remote. The screen behind him filled with Sterling's photograph beside a timeline stretching from 1973 to 2024. Vietnam, 1973. 12 Vietnamese orphans report abuse. Investigation opens, then closes after $500,000 reaches certain officials. Boston, 1982. First wife divorces, receives $800,000 and signs NDA. No explanation given publicly. Chicago, 2009. Jennifer Walsh, 11 years old and deaf, reports abuse. Parents receive $150,000 to stay silent. Each click brought new evidence, new victims, a pattern so consistent it stopped being coincidence and became methodology. The defense will tell you Richard Sterling is innocent, that these accusations represent vindictive bikers targeting a respected educator. I'm going to show you something simpler and more terrible. A man who discovered that wealth plus privilege plus access to vulnerable children equals 50 years of immunity. Until now. Sterling sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than most jurors earned in a month, his expression carefully neutral in ways that suggested expensive coaching. Robert Whitmore beside him radiated the particular confidence of lawyers who'd never lost a case they couldn't buy their way out of. Bear Morrison occupied the front row of public seating, Jake on his left, Doc on his right. 71 Iron Shields members filled every available seat, leather cuts making the gallery look like a biker convention had invaded federal court. Judge Margaret Reeves had initially objected to the dress code before deciding that men sitting quietly in support of child victims represented better behavior than half the attorneys she'd dealt with over 30 years on the bench. The trial structure unfolded across 2 weeks that felt simultaneously endless and too fast. Prosecution built its case with the methodical precision of people who knew they had one chance to get this right. Day 4 brought Elena Martinez. She entered via video link from a child advocacy center, 9 years old and small, even accounting for age, dark hair pulled back with the red ribbon that had become her signature. An ASL interpreter sat beside her. Though Elena's voice, hoarse and unpracticed but gaining strength through therapy, carried her testimony in words she'd learned to speak, despite decades of being told her voice didn't matter. Park's questions came gentle, giving Elena space to answer at her own pace. Can you tell the jury your name? Elena Rose Martinez. I'm 9. I'm deaf. How long have you attended Sterling Academy? 3 years, since first grade. Do you know the defendant, Richard Sterling? Elena's eyes found Sterling across the video connection. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, yes, but also something harder. She'd spent 6 months terrified of this man. Now she stared at him through a camera and didn't look away. He's the headmaster. He hurt me. Can you explain what you mean by hurt? The courtroom went silent in ways that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with collective breath held. Elena's hands moved in ASL even as she spoke, muscle memory translating trauma into signs the interpreter voiced aloud. He touched me in places I knew were wrong. Here. She pointed to her chest, her face burning with shame she shouldn't have to carry. He said it was our secret. Said if I told anyone, my mother couldn't afford school anymore. Said I'd go to public school where nobody knows sign language. Said I'd be all alone. How many times did this happen, Elena? Her fingers counted without hesitation. 17. Juror number 3, a woman in her 50s, mother of 3 according to voir dire, wiped her eyes. Juror 7, a Marine veteran from Afghanistan, had gone stone-faced in the way military men did when managing rage through forced neutrality. Elena, why did you go to the Iron Shields Motorcycle Club? This question carried weight beyond simple information gathering. The defense would argue that bikers had manipulated a confused child. Elena's answer needed to explain agency. I saw Mr. Morrison Bear stop a man from hitting a boy. He signed to the boy, told him he was safe. I followed Bear to find out where he worked. Then when I needed help and didn't know where else to go, I remembered. I went there because I saw him protect someone. Were you scared? Yes, but I was more scared of Mr. Sterling. Park nodded. Let that settle. No further questions. Whitmore stood for cross-examination with the careful movements of someone approaching a minefield. Attacking a 9-year-old deaf girl on the stand represented terrible optics, but letting her testimony go unchallenged meant conceding defeat. Miss Martinez, you said Mr. Sterling told you to keep secrets, but isn't it true that deaf children sometimes misunderstand spoken instructions? Elena's expression hardened into something that made her look older than 9. I'm deaf, not stupid. I know what he did. But you communicate primarily through sign language, correct? And sign language can be ambiguous. Nothing was ambiguous. He hurt me. I told people who believed me. Now I'm telling you. Whitmore recognized defeat and retreated. No further questions. The testimony continued through victims who'd carried silence for decades. Jennifer Walsh, now 24, described abuse at 11 with the flat affect of someone who'd processed trauma through years of therapy. He told me my deafness made me beautiful, that hearing people would never appreciate me the way he did. I believed him because I was 11 and wanted to believe someone saw me as special. 3 other adult victims followed similar patterns: grooming, isolation, threats calibrated precisely to each child's specific vulnerabilities. The cumulative effect left the jury looking shell-shocked. Day 8 brought Daniel Chen. Doc walked to the stand carrying a photograph he set facing the jury before taking his seat. Lily's school picture, 2016 gap-toothed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Park's voice gentled. Dr. Chen, can you tell the jury who that is? My daughter, Lily Chen, born February 2008, died by suicide September 2016. She was 8 years old. The courtroom's collective breathing stopped again. Doc continued, voice steady through force of will. Lily had Down syndrome. Beautiful, sweet, loving. She attended Sterling Academy from 2014 to 2016 in their special needs program. In March 2016, she started having nightmares, panic attacks. She drew pictures of a gray-haired man touching her. I showed the drawings to school administrators. They promised to investigate. Doc pulled an envelope from his jacket. A week later, Richard Sterling called me personally, said he'd looked into my concerns, that Lily was confused, that children with Down syndrome sometimes have difficulty distinguishing reality from imagination. He offered to waive her tuition so we could afford better therapy. What did you do? I thanked him. I thanked the man who was raping my daughter for his generosity. Doc's hands shook. He steadied them against the witness stand. Lily killed herself 6 months later. Left a note I couldn't read for 8 years. When I finally did, after Elena Martinez came to our bar, I understood what I'd missed. He opened the envelope, extracted 3 pages of childish handwriting. This is Lily's suicide note. She wrote, Dear Daddy, I'm sorry. I tried to be good, but I couldn't be good enough. The headmaster at school hurt me in bad ways I don't have the words for. He said I should be grateful he paid attention to me because most people think Down syndrome girls are ugly. He said if I told anyone, he would make sure I got sent to a bad school where people would be mean. I was too scared to tell you good. I love you, Daddy. Tell Mommy I'm sorry. The headmaster's name is Mr. Sterling. Juror number 3 was crying openly now. Juror 7's stone face had cracked into something that looked like murder, barely restrained. Doc looked directly at Sterling. You didn't just rape my daughter. You killed her. You made her believe she was so broken and worthless that death was preferable to living with what you'd done. She was 8 years old. Whitmore had no cross-examination. What could he ask that wouldn't make things worse? The digital evidence came day 10. FBI forensic expert testified to contents of hard drives recovered from Sterling's storage unit, thousands of images spanning 3 decades, metadata confirming Sterling as creator, communications with other predators discussing tactics and victims. The images themselves weren't shown, court protected victim privacy, but descriptions sufficed to make half the gallery leave for air. Day 12 brought Sterling himself. Whitmore had advised against testifying. Prosecutors would destroy him. But Sterling's ego demanded he defend himself, explain that these accusations represented misunderstandings and manipulations. Park approached cross-examination like a surgeon working with a scalpel. Mr. Sterling, you learned ASL specifically to work with deaf children, correct? Yes, I wanted to communicate effectively with my students. And you studied child psychology at Harvard? I did. Understanding child development is crucial for educators. So you understand how children think, how they process trauma, how to manipulate them. Objection. Sustained. Rephrase Mr. Park. You understand child psychology well enough to know which children would be most vulnerable to grooming? Sterling's composure cracked slightly. I've never groomed anyone. These accusations are fabrications by a motorcycle gang with a vendetta. A vendetta based on what? What did you do to provoke 71 veterans to fabricate evidence against you? I don't know. Perhaps they want publicity. Perhaps they're trying to extort money. Park clicked his remote. The screen filled with settlement agreements. Is this your signature on a $150,000 settlement to Jennifer Walsh's family? Yes, but that was to avoid costly litigation. And this $200,000 settlement in 2012? Similar situation. And these 8 other settlements totaling $3.2 million? All avoiding costly litigation despite your innocence? Sterling's lawyer half rose, but Sterling waved him down, ego overriding strategy. Wealthy people get targeted with false accusations constantly. Settlements are cheaper than trials. Even when you're innocent? Especially when you're innocent. Trials are expensive and public. Sometimes paying makes more sense. So you paid $3 million total to avoid defending yourself against false accusations? The trap had been set, Sterling had walked into it, and now Park sprang it shut. Or did you pay $3 million to silence victims whose testimony would have destroyed you decades ago? Sterling's face flushed. That's not, these children were confused. Confused, like the Vietnamese orphans in 1973 who reported you to the State Department? Those accusations were investigated and dismissed after your family donated $500,000 to officials involved in the investigation. Convenient. That's a lie. It's documented in State Department files that FBI unsealed last month. Would you like me to enter them into evidence? Sterling's composure shattered completely. He started to stand, realized he was trapped, sat again with movements that looked mechanical. I'm sick. I have a sickness. I need treatment, not prison. You've had 50 years to seek treatment. You chose instead to rape children and pay for their silence. Your sickness doesn't excuse your crimes, Mr. Sterling. It explains your depravity. Park turned to the jury. No further questions. The deliberation lasted 4 hours. Long enough to suggest thorough consideration, short enough to indicate the verdict was never really in doubt. The foreman, the Marine veteran, 62, Afghanistan and Iraq, stood when Judge Reeves called the court to order. On all 127 counts of sexual abuse of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. Sterling collapsed at the defense table. On all federal charges related to production and distribution of child sexual abuse material, guilty. Whitmore's expression showed he'd known this was coming, but had convinced himself otherwise. On charges of sex trafficking of minors across state lines, guilty. Bear felt Jake's hand grip his shoulder. On RICO conspiracy charges involving family members, guilty. The courtroom erupted. Judge Reeves's gavel came down hard. Order. I will have order or I will clear this courtroom. Silence fell gradually. Sterling was weeping at his table, Whitmore looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. Bear turned to find Frank Murphy 3 rows back. The old man had lost 40 pounds since the investigation began, cancer eating him faster than doctors had predicted. He sat in a wheelchair now, oxygen tank beside him, but his eyes held satisfaction that went beyond simple victory. Their gazes met across the courtroom. Frank nodded once, acknowledgement, gratitude, completion. Sentencing came 2 weeks later after victim impact statements that stretched across 2 days. Each victim's words added weight to the scales, shifting what might have been 20 years into something approaching forever. Judge Reeves read from prepared remarks, her voice carrying the particular tone judges used when they'd seen evil clearly and were done pretending otherwise. Mr. Sterling, I've presided over criminal cases for 30 years. I've seen depravity in many forms. But your systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable children in our society represents a level of calculated evil I struggle to comprehend. Sterling stood between his attorneys, diminished in ways that had nothing to do with the month he'd spent in county jail awaiting sentencing. You held a position of trust. You were educated specifically to understand child development. You used that knowledge not to protect but to prey. You weaponized children's disabilities, their isolation, their dependence on the very institution you controlled. Judge Reeves looked at her notes, though Bear suspected she had the sentencing memorized. On federal charges of production and distribution of child sexual abuse material, I sentence you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole plus 75 years to run consecutively. Sterling's knees buckled. The bailiff caught him. On state charges totaling 127 counts of sexual abuse, I sentence you to 350 years, also consecutive. The math was symbolic. Sterling would die in prison regardless, but symbols mattered. You will serve this sentence at ADX Florence Supermax facility in Colorado, in protective custody for your own safety. You will be registered as a sex offender in perpetuity. All assets totaling $14.2 million are forfeited to the Victim Compensation Fund. She leaned forward slightly. You will never see daylight again except through reinforced glass. You will never touch another child. You will spend however many years you have left reflecting on the lives you destroyed. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none. The gavel fell final. Sterling was led away screaming about appeals and errors and injustice. His screams faded as the door closed, leaving only silence and the weight of justice finally served. Frank Murphy sat in his wheelchair watching bailiffs remove a predator from society permanently, and something in his chest that had been tight for 53 years finally loosened. The hospice room at Northwestern Memorial smelled like antiseptic trying to mask decay, machines beeping rhythms that counted down toward silence. Frank Murphy had 3 days, according to doctors, maybe 5 if his stubbornness overrode his physiology. The cancer had spread everywhere biology permitted, turning his body into something that barely resembled the man who'd founded the Iron Shields 40 years earlier. Bear Morrison sat beside the bed holding Frank's hand. Skin and bone now, muscle wasted, the grip that had once lifted motorcycles reduced to trembling fingers. You did it, old man. Frank's eyes opened, cloudy but aware. We did it. You almost killed him, almost threw everything away. But I didn't. You stopped me. Reminded me justice matters more than revenge. You reminded me first, back when I came home from Desert Storm ready to burn the world. Frank's breathing rattled. Doc Chen adjusted morphine flow, killing pain without killing consciousness, the delicate balance that hospice demanded. That girl in Vietnam, I heard her screaming for 53 years. Last night, first time in 53 years, I didn't. Bear's throat tightened. You saved Ellie, saved all of them. Saved myself, finally. Ellie entered then, Kat Martinez guiding her 9-year-old daughter to the bedside. Ellie climbed carefully onto the mattress, mindful of tubes and wires, and curled against Frank's side the way grandchildren did. Her hands signed what her voice couldn't quite manage. "Grandfather Frank, don't go." Frank's hand, shaking, weakened, rose to sign back. "Have to, little one, but I'm not sad." "Why not?" "Because I saved you. That's all I needed to do before I died." Ellie's eyes filled. "Will I see you again?" Frank's signing grew slower, morphine and exhaustion making movements difficult. "Every time you dance, every time you smile, every time you're brave. I'll be there." Doc checked monitors, met Bear's eyes, shook his head slightly. Hours now, not days. The room filled gradually. Jake Morrison arrived, stood beside his father in ways that suggested recent reconciliation remained fragile but growing. Ghost, Razor, Bull, Gunner. The core leadership. Then more members, then all 71, filling the room and hallway and waiting room until hospital staff stopped trying to enforce occupancy limits. Frank's breathing grew shallower. Bear leaned close. "Old man, brother, you can let go. You did what you needed to. You're done." Frank's eyes found Bear's. "Promise me, keep protecting them. The vulnerable ones, the ones nobody sees." "I promise." "Make it our mission, not just this club, all clubs. Build something that outlasts us." "I will." "And James?" Frank's grip tightened slightly. "You're a good father. To Mia, to the man Jake's becoming. Don't let guilt tell you otherwise." Bear's composure shattered. Jake's hand found his shoulder, grip firm. Frank's attention shifted to Ellie still curled against him. "Elena, you gave my life meaning. Thank you." Ellie signed through tears. "You're my grandfather forever, always. Always." The word came out barely audible. Frank's eyes closed. His breathing slowed, paused, resumed, slowed further, paused longer. At 7:26 p.m. on a Thursday in October, Frank Murphy, Vietnam veteran, Iron Shield's founder, protector of one Vietnamese girl he couldn't save and one American girl he did, died surrounded by 71 brothers who'd become his family and one 9-year-old who'd become his redemption. Bear held his hand until it went cold. Ellie whispered goodbye in ASL that Frank couldn't see, but somehow Bear believed he understood anyway. Outside, 71 motorcycles started in unison, engines rumbling tribute to a man who'd built brotherhood from broken pieces. The funeral drew 500 people to a cemetery that hadn't seen crowds that large since a police officer's memorial 3 years prior. 71 Iron Shield's members formed honor guard flanking the casket, leather cuts and gray beards and eyes that had seen too much but refused to look away. Judge Margaret Reeves spoke, her eulogy unexpected and deeply felt. "Frank Murphy appeared in my courtroom once, charged with crimes he'd committed in pursuit of justice for a child. I was prepared to see a criminal. Instead, I saw a dying man using his last months to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He changed how I think about justice and who delivers it." Elena placed her red ribbon on the casket, signed words to a man who couldn't see but whose memory would carry them. "Goodbye, grandfather. I'll make you proud." Doc's eulogy came last, voice breaking around edges. "Frank gave me family when I'd lost mine. Gave me purpose when I'd lost my way. Gave me a reason to stay sober when sobriety seemed pointless. He saved my life a dozen times over 40 years, and in his last months, he saved my daughter's memory by ensuring her death wasn't meaningless." The burial happened at sunset. Frank lowered into earth next to Sarah's grave, the two of them reunited after 5 years apart. Bear stood at attention, Jake beside him, both Morrison men crying without shame. After mourners left, Bear remained alone at the graveside. He pulled a flask from his jacket, alcohol he hadn't touched in 14 years, poured bourbon onto the earth, and spoke to dirt and memory. "You were more father to me than the man who raised me, more brother than blood ever gave me. You saved my life, old man. Every day for 34 years, you saved my life." Wind stirred through trees, carrying the scent of autumn and endings. "I'm going to keep the promise. Build something bigger than one club. Make protecting children our legacy, not just our mission. You'll live in that, Frank, in every child we save, every predator we stop, every broken man who finds purpose in protection." Bear turned from the grave, found Jake waiting at respectful distance. Father and son walked to their motorcycles side by side, Not quite reconciled, but getting closer. 6 months transformed landscapes in ways geography couldn't measure. Sterling Academy closed permanently. The building sold and converted to a community center named for Lily Chen. Elena Martinez transferred to Chicago Inclusive ASL Academy, where she thrived among peers who understood both deafness and the importance of really listening. Richard Sterling died in prison year 3 of his sentence, beaten to death by inmates who'd learned what he'd done. The investigation concluded with findings of insufficient evidence, a few guards mysteriously looking the wrong direction at the critical moment, and general consensus that some deaths didn't require resolution. Frank Murphy's legacy fund distributed $14 million to victims and their families, paid for therapy and education and legal fees, established scholarships at deaf schools across 3 states. Daniel Chen ran the Lily's Light Foundation from an office above the Iron Shields bar, helping hundreds of families navigate aftermath of abuse. He remarried, a nurse he'd met during Frank's hospice stay, and fostered 3 special needs children who needed the love he'd been unable to give Lily. Jake Morrison's reconciliation with Bear progressed through weekly dinners and honest conversations about what PTSD had stolen and what sobriety was slowly rebuilding. They'd never be close the way fathers and sons should be, but they'd found something that resembled mutual respect and growing affection. Elena Martinez, 10 now, published a children's book titled The Silence Broke, about a deaf girl who found courage to speak her truth. Proceeds funded advocacy programs teaching children to recognize abuse and report it. The Iron Shields expanded to 12 chapters nationally, each one dedicated to protecting vulnerable children. They'd prevented 200 documented abuse cases in 18 months, worked with law enforcement and social services, and became the model for what motorcycle clubs could be when they chose purpose over reputation. Bear Morrison testified before Congress twice, pushing for legislation, strengthening protections for disabled children, and closing loopholes predators used. The Elena Martinez Act passed with bipartisan support, mandating abuse recognition training for all educators working with disabled students. 5 years after Frank's death, the Iron Shields held their annual Murphy's Courage Awards ceremony in the Lily Chen Memorial Center. 127 children honored for escaping abuse and reporting predators, each one receiving a scholarship, leather jacket, and lifetime protection pledge. Elena Martinez, 14 now, confident and radiant in ways that 9-year-old Tara couldn't have imagined, stood at the podium addressing 300 people. Her voice, strengthened through therapy and practice, carried clear and certain. 5 years ago, I was 9 and terrified and alone. I walked into a biker bar because I saw a man named Bear protect another child. I met an old man named Frank who was dying but decided protecting me mattered more than the time he had left. She paused, composure solid despite emotion. Frank taught me that courage isn't looking fearless. It's doing right when you're terrified. He taught me that broken people can still be heroes. He taught me that it's never too late to choose justice. Her hands moved in ASL as she spoke, muscle memory translating meaning into signs the interpreter voiced. Frank Murphy died 5 years ago today, but his legacy lives in every child we've saved. In Marcus, she gestured to a young man in the audience, 16 and college-bound, who came to the bar the year after I did. In the 127 children honored here tonight, in me, Elena's expression shifted into something harder. I'm alive because one old man chose to die protecting rather than live ignoring. I'm strong because 71 bikers believed a deaf 9-year-old when respectable society didn't. I'm safe because broken men decided their mistakes didn't have to define their endings. She looked directly at Bear in the front row, Jake beside him, Doc beside Jake, all 3 men visibly crying. So I ask everyone here, be like Frank, be brave. Protect children who can't protect themselves. Stand up when others won't, because one person can change the world. Her voice strengthened, carrying conviction that came from experience rather than theory. Frank changed mine. Now it's my turn to change someone else's. That's his legacy. That's what never dies. Standing ovation, 300 people on their feet, 71 Iron Shields members standing at attention, hands over hearts, honoring both the girl they'd saved and the man who'd shown them how. Bear stood, moved to the stage, and pulled Elena into an embrace. She signed against his chest where cameras couldn't see. "Thank you for believing me." Bear signed back. "Thank you for trusting us." The ceremony continued through awards and speeches and testimonials. As sunset painted windows gold, Bear found himself at Frank's memorial plaque mounted in the center's entrance. Frank Old Man Murphy, 1952 to 2024. Founder, Iron Shields MC, protector of the vulnerable. He saved the children he couldn't save before. Doc joined him, then Ghost, then Razor, then all 71 members standing in silence before a brass plaque that couldn't capture everything Frank had been, but tried anyway. Bear spoke quietly, words meant for brothers and memory. He asked me to build something that outlasted us, something bigger than one club or one city. I think we're doing that. We are, Doc confirmed. 200 children protected, 50 predators arrested, 12 chapters nationwide. Legislation passed in 8 states, all because one old man chose dying for something over living for nothing. Ghost's voice carried the weight of decades spent in shadows finally brought to light. He showed us that redemption isn't erasing the past. It's using the past to build a better future. We were all broken. Vietnam, PTSD, addiction, failure. But broken doesn't mean useless. Sometimes broken men fix things whole men never see need fixing. Bear turned from the plaque to face his brothers. Frank's last words to me were, "Keep protecting them." That's our mission. Not revenge, not violence. Protection. And we keep doing it until we can't anymore. 71 voices answered in unison. We keep doing it. Outside, motorcycles rumbled to life. The last ride of the day, tradition for every ceremony. 71 bikes plus one riderless motorcycle carrying Frank's cut draped across the seat. They rode through Chicago streets as sunset became dusk, engines echoing between buildings, announcing to anyone listening that protectors still existed even when systems failed. Elena stood at the center entrance watching them go, cat beside her, both Martinez women understanding that family wasn't always blood and heroes weren't always who you expected. The final motorcycle disappeared around a corner. Elena touched the memorial plaque, her small hand resting where Frank's name had been engraved. "Goodbye, grandfather, until I see you in every dance, every smile, every brave choice." She turned from bronze in memory toward a future Frank had died ensuring she'd have. Behind her, the Lily Chen Memorial Center glowed warm with light and purpose. Inside, broken people were healing. Scared people were finding courage. Vulnerable people were learning they deserved protection. Frank Murphy's legacy, built not from perfection, but from finally choosing right after 53 years of wrong. Sometimes that's all redemption is, choosing better before time runs out. Bear Morrison stood at his daughter Mia's soccer game 3 days later, cheering from sidelines while Jake filmed on his phone. 11 years old now, Mia played defense with the controlled aggression Bear recognized from his own youth. When she scored on a breakaway, father and son both cheered, the sound of their voices blending in ways that suggested reconciliation had finally become relationship. After the game, Mia ran to Bear with gap-toothed grin. "Did you see, Daddy? Did you see, Daddy?" "I saw, Princess. You were amazing." Jake handed Bear the phone showing the goal replay. "Send that to me. I'll make a highlight reel." Bear looked at his son, 29 now, confident in ways Bear had never managed at that age, and felt gratitude for second chances he hadn't earned but was determined to honor. "You staying for dinner?" Jake hesitated, old wounds still tender despite healing. "Yeah, I'll stay." 3 words that meant forgiveness wasn't complete but was possible. They drove to a restaurant near the Iron Shields bar, Mia chattering about soccer and school and a boy named Marcus who'd pulled her hair, but she thought might like her. Bear listened with the attention of someone who'd learned that presence mattered more than perfection. Over pasta and conversation, Bear's phone buzzed. Text from Ghost. "New situation, 12-year-old boy, hearing impaired, just showed up at the bar, says his uncle's been hurting him. Kid's terrified. What do you want me to do?" Bear read the message, felt the familiar pull of purpose Frank had instilled in all of them. Jake noticed his father's expression. "Work? Kind of. Kid needs help." Go, we'll finish dinner and I'll take Mia home. Bear looked at his son, seeing acceptance rather than resentment. You sure? Dad, Jake's voice carried something that sounded like pride. Go protect that kid. That's what you do now. That's who you are. Bear stood, kissed Mia's forehead, gripped Jake's shoulder. Thank you. He drove to the Iron Age Shields through city streets Frank had ridden 10,000 times, thinking about cycles and legacies and how saving one person could ripple outward in ways you'd never see but mattered anyway. The boy, Marcus, 13, small for his age, terrified, sat in the same room Elena had occupied 5 years earlier. Ghost had already called Doc. Bear knelt in front of Marcus the way Frank had knelt in front of Elena. My name is Bear. You're safe now. Tell me what happened. And Marcus told him. And Bear listened. And the cycle continued. Because protecting the vulnerable wasn't a mission that ended when one predator fell. It was purpose that lasted as long as broken men chose to use their brokenness to fix what whole people couldn't see was shattered. Frank Murphy understood that truth in his bones, lived it, died proving it. Now 71 brothers carried that truth forward into a future Frank would never see, but had helped create anyway. The ride never ended, the protection never stopped, and every child saved was proof that one old man's redemption could echo across time, transforming guilt into grace and failure into legacy worth leaving behind.